preventing a visitor from bringing in anthrax or something that's not magnetic into the White House.
The United States fully supports Sweden's membership in NATO.
We need people to stand up and fight back, and that's exactly what we're doing.
For me, it was vitally important to be here where the journey to the White House always begins.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Well, it's official. I can say the words cocaine inside the White House and not be accused of auditioning as a writer or performer in a late-night comedy routine. Why? Because testing has confirmed that the powdery substance, it's a phrase from the 80s, I remember, found at the White House on Sunday was, in fact, cocaine. Secret Service agents found it on the ground floor of the West Wing in the area where visitors taking tours are directed to leave their phones. President Biden was at Camp David at the time the cocaine was discovered. Authorities are still working to identify the person who left it there. For more on this, Weijia Jiang and Nicole Killian join us now. Weijia, CBS News senior White House correspondent. Nicole, CBS News congressional correspondent. We must start with you at the White House, Weijia. Catch us up on all that we have learned and what we still want to find out about the cocaine inside the West Wing.
So, Major, the biggest question is who brought it inside the White House. And so far, the investigation has not answered that question. But the White House assures us that the U.S. Secret Service is leading this investigation and will use all of their resources to try to find out who it was, how this unfolded, and, whether they need to update their security protocols in order to prevent this in the future. But to be clear, and, both of you know this, having come here to the White House, when visitors come in, even if it's during a tour, there is a background check before they are permitted. They do have to go through the mags, but unlike TSA, there are not canine units here that are targeting illegal drugs. And so, we did speak to an analyst before who said that perhaps that is one reason why this wasn't immediately detected, because that is not what these teams are looking for. They're looking for biohazardous weapons and, any other hazardous materials that could cause harm. Still, that's not to say this is acceptable. In fact, the press secretary today, peppered with many questions about this, said that the president thinks it is very important to get to the bottom of who brought this in and how it happened. But the leading theory, according to 3 law enforcement officials, tell CBS News that they do believe it was someone who was on a tour here of the West Wing who brought this in and, perhaps dropped it on accident or on purpose, depending on whether, they realized after the fact that they had a dime-sized bag of cocaine. So a lot of questions remain, but so far we don't know who it was.
And Weijia, if you can help us on this, on the question of tours. Now, there are public tours that are stationed initially at the East Wing of the White House, and they go through sort of the most beautiful parts of the residence. Then, as those of us who've covered the White House know, people within the West Wing can conduct tours of their own, which have a little bit specialized access. Do we know what kind of tour this was, or there's any light been shed on that?
Not yet, but we do know there were visitor tours through the West Wing on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday when this bag was discovered. But you're absolutely right. The location of this tells us that it was, in fact, a tour of the working area, that it would have been with a staff member or with a member of the press, someone who works here at the White House, because it was in the entryway of that driveway on the ground level of the White House, where you go in, there's a lobby there, and apparently there are cubbies there where you leave your phones ahead of the tour. And that's where this bag was discovered, nearby somewhere there. So we don't know, again, who was involved, who was here. Remember, this was a holiday weekend, so there may have been more tours than usual. It was a festive atmosphere here at the White House, even though, to be clear, the president and his family were not here. So, I think that the Secret Service is looking at visitor logs. They are also looking at possible surveillance video that might help them. Of course, cameras are not targeted on one area, one person at all times, so it's difficult to tell whether that will come in handy. But they can certainly narrow down exactly who was in this area in the past couple of days and certainly on Sunday when this was found.
And my understanding, you brought this up, as did other reporters at today's briefing. Anything you want to share with us about your interactions with the press secretary?
Well, I did ask her whether or not this is going to prompt the White House to ask the Secret Service to review their security protocols, because the fact is this shines a light on the fact that someone can bring in an illegal substance to the White House. And Karine Jean-Pierre said it's way too soon to talk about any changes in protocol, that the Secret Service is in the middle of their investigation, so they want to wait for those answers before talking about how to proceed from here. But to be clear, this is illegal, right? So if it turns out that they are able to identify who brought this on campus, there's a very high likelihood that it will be referred over to law enforcement, so the person will likely face criminal charges, Major.
No doubt. So, Nicole, you don't have anything that exciting on the political map? I grant you.
A little.
But nevertheless, catch us up on some interesting developments in New York and California over this long holiday weekend.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, with respect to this issue about cocaine being found at the White House, I mean, this is starting to raise concern among congressional Republicans. And today we saw that Tom Cotton actually sent a letter to the head of the Secret Service.
Republican senator from Arkansas.
Correct. Asking for more information to kind of get to Ouija's point. Mm-hmm. How could this happen? Who may have brought this in? So the letter basically asked the Secret Service director to provide more information about how they screen people, whether or not drugs have been discovered at the White House before, and really walk through the mechanisms to try to get to why this happened. Now, he is just one Republican who has pressed the Secret Service, whether or not other Republicans come forward. We've seen, for instance, Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene tweet out criticisms of the White House for allowing this to happen, but will be interesting to see if congressional Republicans continue to ramp up their line of questioning as more information comes out.
Sure, we can imagine a scenario where this might get politicized. I think we can fairly safely imagine that's going to come. What about California and New York?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, look, as we look into the 2024 cycle, we obviously are keeping an eye on key races, both House and Senate. And so today we got two big announcements, one from former Congressman Mondaire Jones, who will be running for the 17th Congressional District in New York. You'll remember there was a big brouhaha in New York for how they redrew their lines in that state in the last cycle. And because of that, Mondaire Jones pretty much got squeezed out of his district, had to run in another one and ended up losing. And so now he will be mounting a bid against freshman lawmaker Mike Lawler, who is a Republican. And this is a district that Democrats are trying to flip. Of course, New York is expected to be a pretty key battleground because we saw a number of Republicans flip that state. Republicans are very proud of that fact because they feel that that helped deliver them the majority this past year. However, Democrats want those seats back. And of course, you have Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who is the top African-American leader in the House, who really is playing a key role in trying to help Democrats win back some of those seats. So that's one race to watch. And then, of course, in California, we learned that California Congressman Adam Schiff pulled in a record more than $8.1 million in this last quarter, in the second fundraising quarter. And that's significant because it's really the most we have seen from any major Senate candidate. I think Raphael Warnock, who had a very expensive Senate race, as I very much recall being in Georgia so many times, but he even outpays Raphael Warnock from the second quarter of 2021. So from that standpoint, I mean, this kind of sets Adam Schiff out front in terms of some of the other candidates in the Senate race. Of course, you've got Katie Porter, Barbara Lee, who have both mounted challenges and who are all competing to replace retiring Senator Dianne Feinstein, who is now back on the Hill.
With that second quarter total, Adam Schiff now has almost $30 million in his campaign war chest. Formidable indeed. Ouija Jiang and Nicole Killian, we thank you. We're learning more about the man arrested outside former President Obama's home last week, what the January 6th defendant was allegedly threatening to do, and who else he targeted. All that coming up. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. There are new revelations in the case against the man arrested near former President Obama's home with weapons last week. CBS News' Scott McFarland has the latest.
In court late Wednesday, the Department of Justice issued a series of new allegations and warnings about Taylor Taranto, a January 6 defendant who was arrested outside the D.C. home of former President Obama last week. The Department of Justice accuses Taranto of having in his van 2 guns, 400 rounds of ammunition, and a machete. They also accuse him of menacing the Department of Commerce's National Institute of Standards and Technology in Maryland and live streaming a threat against that facility, of menacing an elementary school in Tacoma Park, Maryland, just outside of D.C. and right near the home of Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland, and of also making some form of live stream threat against U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Again, the Department of Justice wants Toronto jailed pending trial on his 4 misdemeanors from January 6th. It's also worth noting it's yet another example of the Department of Justice still trying to find January 6 defendants and suspects. They've been looking for him for quite some time and just now found him after the incident outside President Obama's home. Major?
Scott McFarland, thank you. The 2024 GOP candidates did what they would expect them to do over Independence weekend. They hit the campaign trail in early voting states as they tried to close the gap with former President Trump. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis powered through the rain as he marched, maybe trudged through a parade in Merrimack, New Hampshire. DeSantis, like all the rest of the Republican field not named Trump, is far behind the former president. But he's trying to catch up, that is to say DeSantis, and so is Mike Pence and others who are either in Iowa or New Hampshire. For more, CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa joins us now. So former President Trump trashed DeSantis, said he had small crowds, low energy, really doing damage in 2028. Did DeSantis trip and fall in New Hampshire, or is this just part of the process of trying to get some momentum going in the hot summer days?
Oh, it's a hot summer day, so you don't want to read too much into what happens in the summer ahead of a presidential campaign. DeSantis needs to be in New Hampshire.
You better be
because
there.
Iowa's so crowded. I mean, former Vice President Mike Pence and a slew of others are making Iowa their play with religious voters, conservative voters. A lot of them will be there later next week. So if you're DeSantis, who has a little bit of a libertarian streak, at least his libertarian appeal, I've met with some of his supporters in New Hampshire, and they're very much of that school of the GOP. He needs to make sure that they stay rallied around him, that he stays engaged, and he's shaking hands.
I want to ask you about some information that you gathered over the long holiday weekend relevant to Hunter Biden and Denver Riggleman, a name that people in our audience might remember having been associated with the January 6th committee in the House. What can you tell us?
Well, he was also on 60 Minutes.
Yes, he was. Among other places,
He's had a wandering political career. He was a member of the House for one term from the Charlottesville area, Virginia, Republican. Then he became a member of the January 6th committee as a senior technical advisor. He has become a fierce critic of former President Trump. And now he's working with Hunter Biden as a data analyst. Why does this matter to anyone?
Right.
Because it's the next incarnation of the Hunter Biden story. Hunter Biden's now had a plea agreement that's still being finalized with the federal investigation of him and his handling of a firearm and other misdemeanor issues. That's moving toward being settled. What's not settled is the congressional side of the Hunter Biden story. Congress, House Republicans in particular, still looking into Hunter Biden, the Biden family, their finances. And they're using this laptop that was found at a Delaware repair shop in 2019 as the onus of so much of what they're doing in the House GOP. And so Riggleman's role, in a very roundabout way, I know that's a lot there, is to look at this laptop material and assess it for the Hunter Biden team to not just take the House Republicans' word for everything.
Right. And if there's any way through the information found there, pierce any holes, if possible, in the narrative Republicans are trying to present about what the laptop says about Hunter Biden and his conduct.
Riggleman's looking to see if there's any distortion of information, fabrication, really looking at the data to see if it's all accurate.
So I want to get your thoughts on the cocaine in the White House story in the sense that...
In the sense of what, Major?
This afternoon,
I don't know how much I could
the
offer
two
on
leading
this.
Republican candidates for the nomination in 2024, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, have weighed in. Trump on Truth Social with what I think might be more fairly described as an episode, not a post, suggested that Jack Smith is a crackhead, the special prosecutor, and that this is absolutely cocaine, and the only reason it's there is for Hunter and for Joe Biden. And Ron DeSantis said the Biden administration's been blowing it on a lot of fronts. So they're not shy about jumping in on this and try to politicize it immediately. Your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, July has come in like a lamb in terms of the news cycle. The fact that Denver Riggleman joining the Hunter team, now cocaine found at the White House. These are dominating our conversations. I don't think this will have any effect on the presidential campaign. Republicans are always going to look for any kind of fodder to go after President Biden or ask questions about the security of the White House. Raise doubts and insinuate different things. I've seen conservative personalities on Twitter having a bit of a feast with this. But look, I'm just a reporter. You see these issues come up all the time in presidential campaigns, kind of the thing of the day. But it has until we see more evidence or reporting on it, no connection to President Biden. And so it will fade quickly. That is my expectation, unless something changes on that front.
And that will require reporting and verification, as always. Robert, real quickly, before we let you go, we're about a month out of the first scheduled Republican presidential debate, and late last week into the weekend, there were some questions of whether Trump would even show.
I still don't believe he's going to show based on my conversations with his friends and associates, his advisors. They don't see the upside. If he shows up, he's a target. If he doesn't show up, he remains the front runner. Maybe doesn't get strong ratings.
And he takes a lot of the air out of the room if he's not there.
Though, knowing Trump, he loves the element of surprise. He could decide last minute if the political winds are blowing in a certain way to show up.
Real quickly, secondarily, if Trump doesn't show, does DeSantis?
I don't see how you don't show up at this point.
If you're not named Trump, you got to go.
You need the political oxygen. I don't care if you don't love the dynamic.
Robert Costa, as always, we thank you.
Thank you.
We just looked at Republican candidates who hit the campaign trail over the weekend and a lot of other subjects with Robert, as always. Next, we look at President Biden's reelection bid and ask this question. Will a message of unity be the way for him to go in 2024? That answer and more, you're streaming America Decides.
Democracy is never, never, never guaranteed. I hope we all rededicate ourselves to the essential work of our democracy, which is to unify this nation. To see each other not as adversaries, but as fellow Americans.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was, of course, President Biden at the White House's 4th of July festivities, sharing the event with active duty military families, where he stayed, the president did, away from presidential politics, at least for the time being. Mara Gillespie and Christiane Ramos join us now. Mara is founder of Blue Stack Strategies and previously served as an advisor to former House Speaker John Boehner, and former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, Republicans both. Christiane is a Democratic strategist and senior advisor at Way to Win. Christiane, let me start with you. What would you say is the state currently of the Biden re-election campaign? Is it full tilt or still warming up?
I think we're in a warming up stage at this moment. As I understand it, we're really going to be going full in after the summer. Around September is what folks close to the campaign are telling me is when they're really going to begin their launch of the campaigns, going up on air and telling the story of the last 2.5 years, which has been of prosperity and lifting up the American people. Look, we've seen record job creation. We've seen record small business creation. Inflation is actually down nearly to 2% in America. This administration has an incredible story to tell, and they're going to tell it. Whether you're Latino, whether you're Black, whether you're white, you're working, you're creating small businesses, you're creating opportunity. If we get out there and tell that story, I think we're going to be looking pretty good in November of 2024.
Christiane, as you well know, the president in Chicago recently embraced fully the term Biden economics. Interestingly, Republicans do as well, but for different reasons. They want the country to debate from their terms, Bidenomics, because they say the story's mostly negative. Is that where the centerpiece of the 2024 campaign will be fought?
Listen, I think it's going to be fought on two levels. Bidenomics is one of them. And again, we have a record number of jobs, small business creation, inflation coming down, Americans feeling prosperous right now. But the other piece has to be extremism and MAGA. And if Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis is the nominee, that's going to be hard to avoid. What have the Republican Party done in the last 3.5 years? Nothing, literally nothing. They voted against infrastructure, by and large. They voted against the CHIPS Act. They voted against a lot of these very popular programs. They struck down Roe v. Wade. They struck down the student loan forgiveness program. They have taken things away from the American people. And as long as we're having that conversation about the president and all of the things that he's done and how he's helped the American people and all of the extremism of the Republican Party, again, we will be in very good shape in November.
Mara, are you nervous for Republicans generally when Democrats like Christiane say we're going to fight over Bidenomics and extremism?
Not necessarily. I think with things like the student loan forgiveness program, it was also brought up during the debt ceiling debate. And I believe the American people learned that that would have saved them by cutting that program $460 billion, according to the CBO, Congressional Budget Office. So there are plenty of things that the Republican Party and the GOP 2024 candidates can be touting to highlight that the Biden economics is actually a negative, because when they go to the grocery store, they're paying astronomical prices for what they, for their weekly or monthly haul. And that's going to impact them directly. And I think there's going to be a real concern over that, bringing them to the ballot box.
And would you say, Mara, the essence of the Republican argument against Bidenomics is inflation means whatever your wage increases are, they haven't kept up with that inflation. Therefore, and I've seen this in a few tweets from members of Congress, you've had a pay cut for month upon month upon month. Is that the centerpiece?
A lot of it is inflation, obviously. And I think a big part of it, like you had talked about the student loan issue, I mean, erasing that student debt, you can't erase that debt. It goes somewhere. And I think the American people are pretty smart to realize that it goes to the taxpayer. They're still going to be paying for it. So it's not an erase situation. It's still these costs that things aren't free. And to pretend like they are is a disservice to the people who are paying for it.
Christiane, as you look at this race on the Republican side and in your conversations with those on the Biden campaign, do they assume, as many reporters looking at this do, that Trump is in a better position now than he was in 2016, is likely to be the Republican nominee, and this race isn't as fluid as a lot of the other Republican challengers want to suggest?
When I talk to folks close to the Biden campaign, one thing is very clear. They're not taking anything for granted, whether it's Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump. The issue is MAGA and extremism. And again, I go back to this narrative and this story that we have to tell about the last 3 years. Under Democrats, the lowest wage earners in this country saw their wages increase the most. Under Donald Trump, under Republicans, they gave tax cuts to billionaires, to millionaires, to the wealthiest people and corporations, and they didn't help workers at all. On top of that, they created chaos, whether it's Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. They are banning books. They are burning books. They are outlawing words. They do not want women to have autonomy over their body. I don't know anyone in this country who thinks burning books is a good idea. I don't think most Americans support getting rid of Roe v. Wade. So when you tell that story with the story of what we've seen over the last 2.5, 3 years of creation of jobs, small businesses, and the lowering of inflation. Again, we're nearly back to 2% inflation, which is what it was when Joe Biden took office. We will be in great shape in 2024.
Mara, is the Republican presidential nomination battle fluid, or do you think not only, obviously, former President Trump is the front runner, but in all likelihood, the Republican nominee in 2024?
It's not surprising that the incumbent, former president is ahead in the polls, but there's a lot of time between now and Election Day, and I remain hopeful that that will change. I think pointing out a lot of the issues where it's self-serving for President Trump to focus solely on his own issues and himself and his vendettas, people will eventually get sick of that, because there are real issues, as we're discussing, that people are going to be impacted by that don't necessarily involve his recklessness in classified documents and his legal woes. So I remain hopeful. We have great candidates in the GOP 24 lineup. You just showed them there on the screen, and I believe they deserve real consideration by the Republican Party.
Mara Gillespie and Christiane Ramos, we thank you for your time. That does it for today. As you well know, you can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You also know this, but a quick reminder, you are streaming CBS News.